In my last video, I talked a little bit about an experience that I had with an online Vajrayana group. That experience led me to certain conclusions about how one should approach Vajrayana and Tibetan Buddhism in general. And in today's video, I wanted to show you just a few of the books that I've accumulated over the past few months to study and become acquainted with this practice, which is very different from everything that I have known up until now. I've put a bit of time and effort into the research of which books would be of particular use, and I think I'm quite confident that with the books that I'm presenting you here, I will have enough knowledge to satisfy my curiosity about what this is. Now, maybe to note, I am not at any point intending to start calling myself a Vajrayana Buddhist. As I mentioned in my previous video, I am interested from a research perspective. My general outlook is one of, well, I suppose you could say a perennialist, someone who believes that there is truth to be found in all of the religions, especially in their esoteric versions, and so I'm particularly interested in Tantric Buddhism, which, let's not forget, is an existing, living tradition which is as yet unbroken. And as I mentioned in my previous video, this is a collection of technologies that are designed to be applied to a particular tradition, that is the tradition of Buddhism. The reason it's vital to note this is because these technologies are very powerful. And if one was to mess around with them without the intended background for them, one would potentially end up in much more trouble than one might be prepared to deal with, or even capable of dealing with. So let me maybe start us off with a couple of introductory books. First of all, some overviews of Tantra in general and what it is, starting off with Tantric Grounds and Paths. In my previous video, I said that this was probably the book to get if you were only intending to get a single book. How to Attain Enlightenment Through the Practice of Tantra by Geshe Kelsang Gyatso. It's quite a short book. Don't be fooled, this is quite intense. This is in fact a very good overview of Tibetan Buddhism, and to get all of that into so few pages, not a single word can be wasted. That introduction is something that I have read now over 4 times. I get a little bit more out of it every time. Every single difficult term is introduced and explained, but it does also assume that you'll remember it the first time it's explained to you. You can't have any redundancy in so few pages. It is nevertheless fantastic. I really appreciated the way this book gave me an understanding of the mindset of the Tibetan Buddhist. Then we've got over here another really nice introductory book, Vajrayana, An Essential Guide to Practice by Traleg Kyabgon. And this one is, as you can see, it's a little bit shorter than the previous one. It concludes with some practice for dream yoga, which is an interesting practice of Tantric Buddhism. All right, moving on to continuing with these introductions, I was quite interested in Pronaos by Greg Kaminsky, whom you may know from his work with Anathema Publishing. And Greg Kaminsky has written this short introduction to the preliminary practices of Buddhist Tantra from a Western perspective. Again, not a single redundant word, it's very nicely explained, and the Western practitioner is kept in mind at all times, which is quite nice. Now, there is another book that I have that approaches those preliminary works, but not necessarily from a Western perspective, and you can see that it's a much thicker book. This is Words of My Perfect Teacher. When I took a short weekend course with Lama Vajranatha on the topic of Dzogchen, I asked him what book would he recommend for an absolute beginner to get an overview of the whole Tantra, and he said, well, maybe not for an overview of the whole of Tantra, but certainly the first book you should start with would be Words of My Perfect Teacher. It's the book that is recommended by the Dalai Lama for people starting off on the path of Buddhist Tantra. There we are. Now let me move over here for our next presentation. These are 4 volumes of the 10 that exist. I don't have the complete collection yet. This is the Treasury of Knowledge. And this, I suppose, is probably as close as one might get to canonical scriptures for Tibetan Buddhism. This knowledge was compiled by this author whose name I'm afraid I won't attempt to read out loud, but there are 10 books and they start off by explaining Buddhism altogether, right? So this is the very first book, and I've only just received this. This is what basically happened. I saw all 10 books available and I thought to myself, well, actually the last 3 are what I'm particularly interested in. That is a description of the tantric knowledge and practice. However, everything that came before was things like just general Buddhist theory, Buddhist history, the history of how Tantra came to Tibet, and so on and so forth. And I thought to myself, well, that sounds interesting, but what I'm particularly interested in is these 3 final books, right? So the Foundations of Buddhist Study and Practice, the Elements of Tantric Practice, and Esoteric Instructions. Those seemed exciting to me, but following the experience that I explained to you in my previous video, I realized that yes, well, this is all well and good, but the requirement for approaching this, for understanding this, for having this in the context within which it was intended, is to understand everything that came before. And so I have started collecting the books that have come at the beginning of the collection, of course, starting with number 1, which I literally received this lunchtime, and I'm looking forward to tucking into, and then I'll get volume 2, and then volume 3, and then volume 4, and so on and so forth. Some people have actually asked me what the inside of these books look like, so let me show you briefly. These are Shambhala publications, and so they make some books that are as beautiful as they can be at the low price at which they are. I think that those are quite beautiful colors, but you'll see that they are glued pages right there. I don't think that these are going to be particularly solid. I should expect those spines to crack quite easily, and the pages are quite pulpy and high acid content, so they'll go yellow quite fast, I should imagine. There we are. Nevertheless, if they were much more expensive, it would be much less accessible for people, of course, right? Much more difficult to get together entire collections. There we are. Now, there are actually 3 series. This is the first, the Treasury of Knowledge, and Shambhala have just started publishing the second series, the Treasury of Precious Instructions, this one is called, right? So this one is, I believe it's 18 volumes. There are only 6 volumes that have been printed so far, and as you can see, they're not being printed in order. I just received number 5 this lunchtime with the first volume of the Treasury of Knowledge. And you can see that the very latest one to have been published is Sakya, which is the 5th volume in the series. And this series looks at all of the different schools of Buddhist Tantra. I believe there are 8 different schools, and so this looks at the different schools, but also some individual practices, such as Chöd. In fact, Chöd was the very first book to be published in this series. The practice of cutting, release. And this very interesting practice was actually modernized over here by Tsultrim Alioni in Feeding Your Demons. Now, whenever shadow work is mentioned, this book comes up as the best resource for doing shadow work. I have not performed the exercises contained within this work, but my wife has. She swears by this. She says that this is absolutely wonderful. The author, Tsultrim Alione, was teaching Chud, and she was doing this in the West, and she came to the conclusion that there were certain practices that could be done that worked particularly well, and these are the practices that worked particularly well for her and for the people that she was working with. There we are. All right, let's move on to maybe, oh, here we go. Shock Amazement was recommended to me as a really nice book for working with Dzogchen. Dzogchen is one of the very, very many Tibetan Buddhist practices and schools. The idea is to come to a realization of what we in fact are, right? And this book, I am told, is a very, very nice tool for working with Dzogchen. So that sounds very interesting to me. It's very short. It shouldn't take very long to read at all. Next, let's go with a classic. Here we are, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, first complete translation. Let me show you under the cover here. Of course, many of you will have heard of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and maybe you've been looking for a nice edition. This one is quite a nice edition. I've had this tiny version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead I've had this tiny version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead for some time, also published by Shambhala, but the entire book was translated in 2005, and this is the latest printing of it. I think you can buy it in blue, or it was possible to buy it originally in blue with a really beautiful cover. This is, yeah, it's pulpy paper. It's, you know, once again, box bound, far from ideal. However, it does make the contents available to anyone who's interested. There we are. This is a book that describes the afterlife. Okay, the process of dying. We were talking about Dzogchen earlier on. Let me show you maybe these 4 books over here. These are books translated by this translator over here. And they're quite lovely, as you can see. They come in very nice slip cases with the Tibetan R symbol on the front. And if I just show you the little slip that comes along with them, this might give you an idea of what's going on here. This is vital reading for any student of Dzogchen, is what the blurb here suggests. Now we can read at the very top over here, if one knows the self-arisen Vidya Tantra, the self-liberated Vidya Tantra, and the Tantra without syllables, one will have command over the general meaning of the Tantras, like a king who has command over his subjects. That's quite a recommendation right there. I haven't read any of these yet, so I'm afraid I can't actually tell you whether they're worth reading from my own perspective, but I'm sure that so many people can't be wrong. Right, let's move on a little to a very controversial book here, Vajrayana, Complete Guide to Experiential Instructions. Now, if you go to the Amazon page for this book, you'll see some very appreciative voices and some very critical voices saying that these are secret teachings that should never have been shared. But having read the introduction over here, I'd like to share this with you actually, and it may be of some interest to you. And I'll start over here. Rinpoche has often spoken of his firm commitment to not investigate disciples' good and bad qualities or spiritual histories. Only the Buddhas can know an individual's karma and fitness to receive any teaching. In this regard, maintaining unwavering trust in the sources of refuge, Dharma guardians, and the workings of causality, Garshen Rinpoche considers a person's interest in and access to the Dharma sufficient indication of his or her karmic connections. I'll continue reading a little. Because this manual includes secret teachings, I asked Rinpoche about the threshold for readership. He responded with the following words. It is said that compassionately looking with a long-range view of the future time of dregs, the Buddhas taught mantric sadhanas. Today, that future has become manifest. Right now is the time of dregs, in which secret mantra teachings must be propagated. As Guru Padma prophesied, when the wicked era burns like fire, the potent force of secret mantra will blaze forth. Because of this, and because it is far better to receive the Buddha's teachings than not, Rinpoche has offered the instructions herein without demanding prerequisites like empowerment. Maintaining pure perception without investigating or discriminating, he has given the Dharma with an open hand. This is one of the ways in which he upholds his samaya, or commitment to beings and to the sources of refuge. It is not Rinpoche's style to offer the Buddha Dharma in a prescriptive way, establishing and policing rules of conduct. Instead, disciples must mature beyond outwardly imposed dictates, taking personal responsibility for our own actions, which are to be tempered by love and heedfulness of cause and effect. Thus, how we approach, receive and integrate Rinpoche's instructions, how we uphold our own samaya, is a matter we must ultimately determine for ourselves. What a very different perspective, what a very different approach this is to the approach that I encountered a couple of weeks back that I talked about in my previous video. It's naturally not up to me to say which is the right way and which is the right attitude, but I can definitely say that we must be responsible for our own attitude and the way we individually approach these instructions and bodies of knowledge. There we are. That's Vajrayana. Now there are a couple more books that I will show you here. First of all, the Flower Ornament Scripture. Now this was recommended to me by a good friend of mine, and in fact I've only really just opened the book, read the introduction and read the first few pages of book one. As you can see, it's a massive volume. I have found the words in these first few pages so deeply beautiful. They're a description of the Buddha mind in very visual, very sensual language, and they can't do anything but affect the reader. A very, very wonderful bit of literature. The binding is really mediocre compared to what it really should be. It's beautiful, don't get me wrong, but once again we're looking at quite a cheap production that makes it affordable, which is wonderful, but on the other hand it doesn't make it durable. So there we are. I can't really tell you very much more about it, but I can recommend going to read up on it, finding out a little bit more maybe about what is contained in the Flower Ornament Scripture. Right, the Avatamsaka Sutra. There we are. 2 more books to go, and these are modern writings by Westerners. This is Kurukula, Goddess of Bewitchment. When I presented this book some time ago, I did a complete review of this book, and got a few people in the comments saying, yeah, you shouldn't be recommending these books. The information within is designed for people who have received empowerments and so on. I think that there is a big difference between reading about practice and going ahead and practicing. All right. So that's definitely from my perspective. And then finally, Sharp Practice, which I've also reviewed. And I'll link down to the reviews down below. And this is an introduction to Vajrayana, right? The practice of the Purba, the Tibetan dagger. That's it, folks. That's my Tibetan collection of books. I hope that you found something of interest. I hope that you have picked up a few tips. And yeah, don't forget to leave a comment if I've missed out any of your favorite Tibetan books. And maybe if you've read any of the books that I've presented today, you can give your opinion on them. I'd like to thank very particularly all the members who keep this channel alive. I really can't thank you enough. And in particular, thank you to the level Infinity members, the Lux Eterna members, as well as the level 3 members, the Magister Venerabilis members, whose names you can see scrolling up on the left-hand side over there. Thank you so much for your support. It really means the world to me. And to everyone watching, if you'd like to support the channel in any way, please don't forget to leave a thumbs up down below and to subscribe if you haven't done so already. I also have a Patreon which you can join if you'd really like to support the channel. And if you'd like to have a one-to-one video chat with me, there are options to do that as well down in the description. I can also read your tarot if you wish. Thank you ever so much for joining me once again this week, and I'll see you very soon with another video. Take care of yourselves and of each other. Bye-bye.